Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Steven Walt. He's been a distinguished scholar of political science and international relations. He has published 3 important books and numerous articles. He's also been an academic administrator, dean of the School of Government, of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and that's where he now is the Belfer Professor of International Relations. Professor Walt came to national attention when he and John Mearsheimer, who was a presidential lecturer in the spring of last year, published an article titled "The Israel Lobby." And this is in fact his topic this afternoon. This evening, you will get a full account of his accomplishments when he will address the question, what went wrong with U.S. foreign policy? So this will be this evening at 8 o'clock in the University Theater. His topic this afternoon is the Israel Lobby and United States foreign policy. Professor Walt.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and I want to thank the members of the Presidential Lecturer Selection Committee for inviting me to come to Missoula. The topic I'm going to speak about today is an important issue for all Americans, and I think for all of the countries in the Middle East. So I'm especially pleased to have the chance to talk about this in a community of scholars so we can have a serious and substantive discussion. Needless to say, my topic today is the influence of the so-called Israel lobby on U.S. foreign policy, and I'm going to summarize the main points of the article that I wrote with John Mearsheimer. I'm also going to talk about the recent war in Lebanon, which we obviously didn't write about because it hadn't happened yet, and show that it's hard to understand what happened there and what happened with U.S. policy if you don't understand the role of the lobby as well. Our bottom line, as many of you already know, is that the influence of the lobby has led to policies that are not in the U.S. national interest, not in the interests of other countries in the region, and also not in Israel's interest as well. I say that last point to underscore that our work is not anti-Israel. On the contrary, both John and I strongly support Israel's existence, and we believe the lobby's activities have in fact been unintentionally harmful to the U.S. and to Israel alike. And let me lay out now the main arguments in the paper. First, we describe the level of support that we provide. The United States gives Israel a level of economic and diplomatic support that far exceeds what it gives any others. About $3 billion a year in economic and military aid, which comes out to about $500 per year per Israeli. This aid is largely unconditional. It's not linked to Israeli behavior. It gets the aid when it builds settlements, even though every American president since Lyndon Johnson has thought the settlements policy was a bad idea and wrong. It gets its aid when it spies on us, when it sells American high technology to countries like China, when it attacks civilians in the West Bank, Lebanon, or Gaza. It also gets consistent diplomatic support. Since 1982, for example, the United States has vetoed 33 UN Security Council resolutions that were critical of Israel. That's a total greater than all of the vetoes by all other Security Council members put together in that same period. We take Israel's side when war breaks out in the Middle East, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. And we tend to favor Israel's side in peace talks. Former U.S. negotiator Aaron Miller said after the Oslo process that we had acted as Israel's lawyer throughout that. He was part of the negotiating team, and our policy, in my view, has been even more one-sided under President Bush. No other country gets this level of backing or is so exempt from criticism by public officials. That's our first point. Our second point is that this level of support can't be fully explained on either strategic or moral grounds. With respect to strategic interests, you can make an argument, and I think you can make a pretty good argument, that Israel was a useful ally during the Cold War. But the Soviet Union is gone. The Cold War is over, and we don't face a great power rival. Today, the justification is that Israel is a key ally in the war on terror, and that in American efforts to combat rogue states like Syria or Iran. That's the main strategic justification now, and I want to suggest there's a couple of problems with that rationale. First, it's got the causal logic backwards. We don't support Israel because we have a common problem with terrorists. Rather, we have a terrorism problem in good part because we are so closely tied to Israel. Now, please note, I am not saying that anti-American extremism and anti-American terrorism is solely caused by our support for Israel. It's not the only grievance they have, but it is a very important one. This was the conclusion reached in the 9/11 Commission report. This was the conclusion reached by separate studies by the State Department's Commission on Public Diplomacy, the Pentagon's Defense Science Board as well. Numerous surveys of Arab public opinion confirm their strong resentment at unconditional U.S. support for Israel, and this, of course, makes it easier for people like Osama bin Laden to recruit people into these groups. And finally, bin Laden's own statements make it clear that this was an issue for him, and it was an issue for him long before September 11th. In fact, the 9/11 Commission also found that he had even tried, unsuccessfully, but he had tried to time the attacks to highlight the issue as well. Now, again, I want to emphasize, it's not the only grievance bin Laden has, but it is an important one. Second, although the United States clearly has some differences with some other states in the region, it turns out that Israel is the main piece or main element of friction between us and them. For example, President Bush has said we don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons because, quote, it would threaten our ally Israel. Now, there are many other reasons why we don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons either, but we shouldn't overstate that particular danger to us. These states could not use their nuclear arsenals without facing retaliation, and that means threatening to use them or trying to blackmail us, or for that matter, trying to blackmail Israel, which has a nuclear arsenal of its own, simply isn't credible. Finally, Israel's own nuclear arsenal is one reason why these countries want weapons of mass destruction themselves, and that, of course, makes it harder for us to put pressure on them, because they immediately turn around and say, yes, but what about the Israelis? Third, and perhaps most important, Israel isn't much of an asset when it comes to dealing with these particular problems. For example, it couldn't participate in the 1991 Gulf War or the 2003 Gulf War without undermining the US-led coalition. In fact, the United States had to divert some of its military assets to helping protect Israel in both those conflicts. So it wasn't a strategic asset in that sense as well. But the bottom line here is that unconditional support for Israel makes winning the war on terrorism harder, not easier, and makes it harder to deal with so-called rogue states like Syria or Iran. So there's no compelling strategic rationale for the current level of American support. The second rationale for unconditional American support is derived from a set of moral arguments. We ought to back Israel, it is said, because it's vulnerable, surrounded by enemies, it's the only democracy in the Middle East, or because its conduct has been substantially better than that of its adversaries, and especially the Palestinians. We've all heard these arguments many times, and they sound convincing, but again, if you look at them carefully, they cannot explain why we give Israel so much support and so unconditionally. Now, let me emphasize that John Mearsheimer and I believe there is a strong moral case for Israel's existence, based on the long and despicable history of anti-Semitism, and especially the tragic experience of the Holocaust. We also believe that the United States should help protect Israel if its survival were in jeopardy. But the good news here is that Israel's existence is not in jeopardy. It is the strongest military power in that region. It has several hundred nuclear weapons of its own. It is not going to be erased from the pages of history, no matter what some Islamic radicals or Iran's president might say. And let me be very clear again, I think that's a very good thing. Israel does have some security problems, But the taproot of those problems is its failure to achieve a just peace with the Palestinians. Israel's defense forces are not all powerful, but no serious person thinks Hezbollah or Iran can threaten Israel's existence today or in the foreseeable future. So what about the rest of the moral case? It is true, certainly, that Israel's a democracy, but this can't explain why we support it so heavily. There are many democracies in the world, but none of them get the kind of support that Israel gets. Also, there are some aspects of Israeli democracy that are inconsistent with American democratic principles. For example, the United States is a melting pot, a liberal democracy where all ethnic and religious groups are supposed to have equal status. Israel, on the other hand, was explicitly founded as a Jewish state. Its non-Jewish population is treated as second-class citizens, according to Israel's Orr Commission in 2003, which examined the condition of the Arab population. It found that the Israeli government behaved in a discriminatory and neglectful manner towards its own Arab citizens. Israel also denies political rights to its Palestinian subjects. So yes, Israel is a vibrant democracy in many ways, but only for part of its people. Now, my point here is not to single out Israel for criticism because no government is perfect. Rather, it's simply to suggest that Israel's democratic character cannot explain why we give it so much help. Similarly, you can't justify American support by claiming that Israel has behaved better than the Palestinians. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here, but I think a fair-minded look at the historical record shows that both sides are guilty of terrorism, of wartime atrocities, and a great deal of brutal behavior. To be clear, Palestinian terrorism is wrong, and in my view has been counterproductive. But the Zionists use terrorism in their own struggle to obtain their own state, and Israel's treatment of its Palestinian subjects today is brutal and morally indefensible. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just ask respected human rights organizations like Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, or the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem. And plenty of former Israeli officials, including 4 former officials in Shin Bet, Israel's domestic security organization, would agree. They wrote in November 2003 about Israeli policy in the occupied territories, quote, "We are behaving disgracefully. Our conduct is patently immoral." Or as Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak once said, "If I had been born a Palestinian, I would have joined a terrorist organization." All countries have shameful episodes in their past. We certainly do. And I am not saying that Israel has acted worse than other countries have. I want to be very clear about that. International politics is a hard-headed business. But it's not acted any better either. It's not surprising given the neighborhood it's been in and what its position has been. So you can't explain American support on that basis either. Well, so if you can't explain this remarkable relationship on strategic or moral grounds, then the question is, how do you explain it? And for us, the answer, at least much of the answer, is the influence of the lobby. Let me talk a little bit about that. We define the lobby as a loose coalition of individuals and groups who work openly to influence U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. It is not a centralized movement. There are a number of clear differences among different groups within it. It is not synonymous with American Jews, because a significant percentage of American Jews don't care that much about Israel. In lots of surveys, that shows that. Others do not support the lobby's positions. AIPAC, for example, does not speak for every American Jew. And some of the groups that work on Israel's behalf and are quite important aren't Jewish at all, so-called Christian Zionists. So we do not use the term Jewish lobby. We use Israel lobby, much more accurate. It is not a cabal, it is not a conspiracy, and there is nothing improper or illegitimate about what it's doing. It's just another special interest group, and interest groups are a central feature of American political life. In a sense, the Israel lobby is as American as apple pie. How does it work? Why is it so powerful? Well, again, we know from the study of American politics that small groups with a focused agenda often wield disproportionate political influence because they care a lot about a single issue, they work 24/7, and because they can hold crucial swing votes in elections. If the rest of the population is largely indifferent to what they care about, these groups are likely to get their way, despite being relatively small numbers. Think of the Farm Lobby, the National Rifle Association, Cuban Americans, Greek Americans, Irish Americans, etc. So this is, again, wired into the structure of the American political system. Second, the Israel lobby happens to be particularly good at this. It's well-funded and quite effective. AIPAC's annual budget is almost $50 million. It has a large full-time staff, regional offices in key cities. Jewish Americans are extraordinarily generous. They make large campaign contributions as well as large philanthropic contributions elsewhere. And AIPAC, of course, works to steer these campaign contributions to encourage politicians to adopt pro-Israel political positions. Groups and individuals in the lobby write letters, articles, op-eds defending the U.S.-Israel relationship. They go directly on Capitol Hill to talk to legislatures, interview candidates to make sure that they have the right views, write legislation, provide talking points, do lots of things that make a congressman's life a lot easier. And finally, they work hard to shape public discourse so that Israel is viewed favorably by most Americans. Among other things, this involves attacking anybody who questions Israeli policy or American support for that policy. This is relatively easy to do because most mainstream American media organizations tend to be pretty pro-Israeli. And when they're not, some of these groups will then organize boycotts and blacklists and letter writing campaigns against media groups and organizations that say things that they don't approve of about Israel. Finally, within Washington, most of the large think tanks in Washington, like the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which was spun out of AIPAC, founded by the former research director at AIPAC, and Brookings, the Brookings Institution, all tend to tilt rather sharply in a pro-Israel direction. There are not very many think tanks you can find in Washington that lean the other way. A few, but they're very small, pretty obscure. For all of these reasons, the power of the Israel lobby is quite well known. In a 2005 survey in National Journal, AIPAC was ranked number 2 in a survey of congressional staffers as the number 2 most powerful lobby in Washington. It was tied with the AARP. And it was also ranked second in a similar survey by Forbes magazine in 1997. Bill Clinton said AIPAC was better than anyone else lobbying in this town. Newt Gingrich, who doesn't agree with Clinton on most things, said it was the most effective general interest group across the entire planet. Former Senator Fritz Hollings said as he left office, "You can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here." And Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert recently said, "Thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world." Even Alan Dershowitz, you'd think if you read Alan Dershowitz on me that we made this whole thing up. But Alan Dershowitz said in one of his books, quote, "My generation of Jews became part of what is perhaps the most affecting lobbying and fundraising effort in the history of democracy. We did a truly great job." That's his book, Chutzpah, 1991, page 16. Now this raises an interesting question. Why was our article so controversial, given that we were saying something that everybody basically knows? All right, I'll get back to that in a little while. All right, finally, we argued that the lobby had powerful and negative impact on U.S. Middle East policy. And I want you to think about this by considering the counterfactual. What would U.S. Middle East policy look like if the lobby were less influential or if the lobby advocated a different set of policies? First of all, if the lobby were less powerful, the U.S. would have used its leverage to halt the settlements project. As I said before, every American president has opposed them, but none was willing to pay the political price to stop them. Instead, the United States essentially subsidized them. Many Israelis now understand that the settlements were a tragic mistake. They radicalized the Palestinian population, encouraged the growth of Islamic extremism, cost billions of dollars, thousands of lives, and undermined Israel's image around the world. So here, the lobby's influence undermined Israel's security along with our own. If the lobby were less influential or favored different policies, we would have adopted a more independent policy towards the peace process instead of acting, to repeat, as Israel's lawyer. Some of our critics have said that the failure of the peace process is really Yasser Arafat's fault, not the lobby's. But if Arafat was the problem, why hasn't the United States done anything to support the democratically elected Mahmoud Abbas, who has recognized Israel, rejected terror, and called for a negotiated settlement? What does the United States do? Nothing. In fact, we then endorse further Israeli encroachments on the West Bank. What's the result? The election of Hamas, leaving everybody, including the Israelis, worse off. If the lobby were weaker, we argue the United States would have been much less likely to have invaded Iraq in 2003. This war was conceived by neoconservatives, encouraged by a number of Israeli leaders, endorsed by groups like AIPAC. The point I want to emphasize here, because we're often misunderstood on this, it is not the only reason why the United States went to war. Indeed, it couldn't get either Clinton or Bush to go to war by themselves, even though groups in the lobby had been pushing for this from the late 1990s onward. The key additional factor, of course, was September 11th, 5 years ago today, which turned both Cheney and Bush in favor of the war. So without September 11th, you don't get the Iraq war, in my view. But it's worth noting that neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz in the Defense Department were quick to link Saddam to 9/11, and key groups in the lobby pushed hard to make that same case. So we argue the Israel lobby was a necessary but not sufficient condition for war. Again, no lobby, the war would have been less likely. No September 11th, also less likely. Number 4, if the lobby were weaker, our policies towards Iran would have been more flexible and I think more effective. For the past decade or more, a number of prominent Americans have called for a more flexible policy, but they got nowhere because AIPAC and others pushed for a very hard-line policy vis-a-vis Iran. Iran has actually made several overtures to the United States, most recently in 2003. They also provided us with a lot of help after September 11th, and we rewarded them by putting them in the axis of evil and by saying we favored regime change there. The result of all of this, of course, is the election of a more hardline government, including President Ahmadinejad, the reinforcement of Iran's nuclear ambitions. Once again, not good for the United States, not good for Israel. And finally, if the lobby were weaker, the United States' response to the recent war in Lebanon would have been markedly different. Now, this was not in our original paper, so I'm going to go into a bit more detail as to what happened here, with the caveat that this is sort of instant history, and there's lots of things we still may not know about exactly what was going on. Our understanding of this may change a little bit as more information becomes available. So take all of this with a little bit of that caveat there. All right, we all remember how this happened. There's this sort of simmering conflict between between Hezbollah and Israel's skirmishes along the Israeli-Lebanese border. Hezbollah is arming. This is widely known. Israel is formulating possible responses, perfectly sensible thing for the Israelis to do because they're worried about Hezbollah's growing strength. Then Hezbollah kills and captures a couple of Israeli soldiers near the Israeli-Lebanese border. There are some diversionary attacks at the same time on some Israeli towns, not very many of them, but some. Israel responds to this with a massive escalation against Lebanon, attacking targets throughout. Hezbollah then responds by firing lots of rockets into Israel. This goes on for nearly a month, and then finally a ceasefire gets imposed. All right, what's the evidence of American support? First of all, we were informed of Israel's plans to go after Hezbollah well in advance. This has been reported in a number of different places, including by some Israelis. Now, let me emphasize here, I'm not suggesting there was some kind of Washington, Tel Aviv conspiracy here to trigger or provoke a war. Rather, the Israelis were doing what you would expect any country to do. It's what I would do if I were an Israeli. You've got a problem on your northern border, you'd prepare plans for ways of dealing with it. All right, whether the plans were smart or not is a separate question, but I don't accuse them of anything. And the second thing, of course, you'd talk to the Americans about it. You would talk to your principal ally and make sure that we were on board if you decided to do something. Once the war escalated and Israel was being widely criticized for an excessive response, we gave it lots of diplomatic cover. We vetoed the initial UN Security Council resolution. We worked, in fact, to prevent the United Nations from imposing a ceasefire, and we had a very good reason for that. We wanted to give Israel time to crush Hezbollah. We thought the plan was going to work. We also worked to safeguard Israel's interests in the final negotiations over Resolution 1701. And in fact, Ehud Olmert, Israeli Prime Minister, called Bush to thank him for this afterwards. Bush and other American officials defended Israel's actions in public and never offered any criticism. This was sharply different than most other world leaders. We also provided them with military intelligence during the conflict and resupplied Israel with smart bombs, precision-guided weapons, when they were running low. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, the Democrats and Republicans were both falling all over themselves, trying to show which was more pro-Israeli. The House eventually passed a strongly worded resolution supporting Israel's actions by a vote of 410 to 8. The Senate version of this bill passed unanimously with 62 sponsors. The mainstream media was also strongly pro-Israel throughout this. There's an industry journal that sort of follows the media. It's called Editor and Publisher. And they did a survey of dozens of newspapers after the first week and found, quote, almost none of them have condemned Israel's attack. The point I want to emphasize here is this was quite different than the response everywhere else around the world, where many people were critical. Now, you could argue that this made sense because Hezbollah is a terrorist organization and it made sense for us to give Israel a green light and then back their efforts to do that. So you could make the argument that this was in our strategic interest, but I think that's wrong. Backing Israel to the hilt further damaged America's image in the region. Backing Israel's campaign made Hezbollah stronger, reinforced the links to the extent that they're there between Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. It gave Syria and Iran an even bigger incentive to make our lives difficult in Iraq, which is where they're already tough enough. It damaged the fragile democracy that we were previously so proud of in Lebanon. We had been claiming lots of credit for the Cedar Revolution. We'd helped incubate democracy there. And that, of course, now we're allowing our other ally in the region to attack that democracy. It undermined the governments in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, who had to back away from us openly. It even alienated the Shia population of Iraq, right? Thereby making our task even harder there. So giving Israel the green light and backing it to the hilt was not in America's strategic interest. And by the way, here the issue is not whether Israel had the right to defend itself. It surely does. So responding to the attack, the capture of the soldiers, was clearly appropriate. It's rather whether the particular response they chose was in America or Israel's interest. And I think it's clear it was not. Now, it was also not in the moral interest of the United States. You can't make, I think, a strong moral argument here. Again, I think a response to what Hezbollah did was understandable. But Israel also decided to inflict massive damage on Lebanese civilians, right? According to the Chief of Staff, Dan Khalutz, we intend to turn back the clock in Lebanon by 20 years. That's what he said, not what I made up, what he said. The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Gillerman, said, to those countries who claim we are using disproportionate force, I have only this to say, you are damn right we are. Again, that's what he said. There were 7,000 airstrikes at 7,000 targets, 2,500 naval bombardments, 1,183 deaths, about a third of them children, about 900,000 and change Lebanese civilians displaced from their homes, vast amounts of infrastructure damage. Laws of war argue that there are two things you're supposed to do. You're supposed to the extent that you can, avoid hitting civilians, and second, use proportionality, right? Your response should not be disproportionate. It's pretty clear that neither of those was observed. And Israel's policy was studied by both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and each has concluded, to quote the latter, Israel has violated one of the most fundamental tenets of the laws of war, the duty to attack only military targets, and, quote, there was a systematic failure to distinguish between combatants and civilians. I might add that Human Rights Watch also investigated the possibility that this was because Hezbollah had been using civilians as human shields, putting all of its things in villages and stuff like that, and they found that there was very little evidence of that actually happening, that lots of Israeli strikes took place on places where there was no reason to assume there were any Hezbollah nearby. If morality were driving U.S. policy, then the Bush administration would have been working from day one to stop the war. It would have criticized Israel's conduct. All right, last point here, what's the evidence that the lobby's influence was at work? Well, first of all, there was lots of reports in various press accounts that AIPAC and other groups were working overtime once the war came out, taking out ads in the New York Times, doing lots of fundraising. AIPAC intervened to get some language taken out of the congressional resolution. The original draft of the resolution had a clause in it that urged all sides to protect life and infrastructure. Sounds like a fairly reasonable thing. AIPAC wanted it out, and it came out. Then a Democratic representative, Chris Van Hollen, I think he's from Maryland, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice saying that the Israeli response was counterproductive. He said this will, in fact, increase Lebanese anger at the United States. He blames Hezbollah for the conflict. It's a rather mild letter, not very problematic, but he does say, we've really got to shut this one down. It's going to really hurt our interests in the region. He then got visited by representatives from a number of major Jewish organizations, and he quickly backtracked, saying he was actually not criticizing Israel, he was just criticizing the Bush administration. And then several of these groups said he needs to continue, and I'm quoting now, to reach out to reassure the Jewish community he's going to be there for Israel. The Washington director of the Anti-Defamation League also said that his apology didn't undo the damage of his first letter. Now again, I want to emphasize that I think these statements by these representatives of these organizations do not necessarily reflect the opinions of many American Jews who thought Israel's response was excessive as well. At the very beginning, by the way, President Bush had very gently encouraged Israel to be careful not to topple the democratic government of Lebanon. And according to the Jewish newspaper Forward, the administration was, quote, criticized by some Israeli and Jewish community officials for this. Abraham Foxman, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, actually said, the administration and Western countries want to shore up the Lebanese government, but this is a misguided policy, and the same holds true for Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader. And Bush stopped talking about going easier on Lebanon. Last point. Key organizations like AIPAC actually talked about their influence in the open. Howard Friedman, the president of AIPAC, sent a letter to supporters which began, "Look what you've done," and said, "Only one nation in the world came out and flatly declared, 'Let Israel finish the job.' That nation is the United States, and the reason it had such an unambiguous view of the situation is you and the rest of American Jewry." Now again, he's saying this, not me. I might add this was also true of the so-called Christian Zionists who held a big rally in Washington, D.C., and the executive director of the group Christian Friends of Israel offered the rather unchristian comment that this was certainly an unprovoked attack and Israel has every right to go in and pound them. Now, you sometimes hear that this was, that our leaders backed Israel in this war because that's what American public opinion wanted. They were just reflecting American public opinion. But I think if you look at public opinion polls, you'll see that although there was certainly some support, some considerable support for Israel within the American body populace, and there's a general strong support for it, the American people wanted a much more even-handed policy. According to an ABC News poll, 46% of those surveyed thought Israel and Hezbollah were equally to blame for what was happening. A CBS New York Times poll found 40% saying that the U.S. should support neither side. 7% thought we should criticize Israel. 39% thought we should support Israel. Again, there's support there clearly for Israel, but it's a much less overwhelming picture. CNN, 43% said Israel should agree to an immediate ceasefire. That was on July 19th, by the way. So again, I don't think you can make the case that it was just reflecting American public opinion. I think rather it reflects some general public opinion, but also the amount of direct pressure being put on by the lobby. Last point here is, of course, that the war in Lebanon and America's policy when it happened was very bad for everybody. It was a disaster for the Lebanese. It harmed our own interests, but I think it was also a disaster for Israel, who would have been better off if we had told them not to do it, forced them to come up with a smarter response to the provocation, and then once it happened, it would have been better if we had shut it down quickly, but that was impossible given the political climate here. In all of those cases, right, all of the counterfactuals I've just discussed, our policy has been bad for the United States and bad for Israel too. Israel itself, in my view, would be better off if the lobby were less influential or if it were politically powerful but supported a different American approach. All right, now I want to talk about a couple things we didn't say in our article and then say a little bit about the reaction to it after it was published, and then I'll stop. Two things we didn't say. We did not say that the Israel lobby was all-powerful. We, in fact, explicitly said just the opposite, although our critics have persistently ignored that. To repeat, this is not some secret cabal that controls our foreign policy. Right? Any organization that holds an annual meeting with thousands of people in attendance and the major leaders of both parties is not a secretive organization. Right? And there are some countervailing forces out there. There are other things that shape our policy, although I think they tend to be much weaker. Also true that the Israel lobby doesn't get its way on every single issue. But nobody who's worked on these issues in Washington would deny that it is a very effective set of organizations and individuals, and I think they get their way more often now than they used to. Second, we did not and do not accuse anyone of being disloyal to the United States, and we never suggest that people who lobby on Israel's behalf are doing anything wrong. All of us in the United States have many commitments and affinities to our country, to our religion, to family, sometimes to our employers, not always. It is entirely permissible in the United States for those diverse commitments and attachments to manifest themselves in political life. That's, again, what interest groups are all about. People like Paul Wolfowitz or Doug Feith or Richard Armey, people who work for AIPAC, advocate policies they think are good for Israel and good for the United States alike. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I also don't think there's anything wrong when others point out that these individuals and these groups have a set of commitments and attachments that do shape how they think about the Middle East and the policies that they favor in the region. Similarly, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that the views they think are in America's and Israel's interests might not be in the best interests of both countries. All right, now, before I sum up, I want to say a few things about the public reaction to our original article. Needless to say, it's been an interesting experience. We knew it was likely to be controversial. We were disappointed, and have been disappointed, that much of the reaction consisted of attacks on our characters or discussions of rather extraneous issues rather than on a serious discussion of our central arguments. As I said before, we actually didn't say very much that wasn't common knowledge inside the Beltway. And our analysis relied on mainstream sources like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Haaretz, Forward, rather than Al Jazeera and lots of radical publications. As I noted earlier, Washington insiders in both parties are well aware of the influence we were describing. It wasn't what we said that was so upsetting. It was the fact that two card-carrying members of the foreign policy mainstream, sort of impeccable middle-of-the-road credentials, absolutely no trace of anti-Semitic attitudes or behavior, finally pointed out the elephant in the room. Now, what happened after we did? Well, there was the predictable accusation that we are anti-Semites and various attempts to smear us by associating us with a variety of extremists. This, again, is completely predictable. When people do not have good counter-arguments, they rely on name-calling instead. But it's a very effective tactic because anti-Semitism is a loathsome practice and nobody wants to be accused of it. But it's a very effective tactic, A, because it helps intimidate people from speaking out, and second, it's a way of smearing people, making them controversial as a way of silencing them. Because, of course, once you become controversial, then lecture committees may be disinclined to invite you to give a public address someplace. All right. So this kind of charge, even if it has absolutely no validity whatsoever, is a very effective political tactic. You can always count on people to then repeat it once it's offered. Needless to say, none of the people who have made this charge have ever offered any evidence to support it, for the simple reason that there isn't any. There was lots of attention also on extraneous issues. One of the favorites was whether or not I had been asked to step down from my position as academic dean of the Kennedy School as a result of this. For the record, I wasn't. I had actually announced that my term was coming to an end and that they had to find a replacement months before the article actually appeared, and an email had been sent to the entire faculty weeks before the article appeared asking for nominations for my successor. So that was a complete red herring, but lots of people in the blogosphere wanted to chase that one around for a while. When people did discuss the substance, they either misrepresented our arguments, said that we said lots of things that we didn't say, or erroneously accused us of making lots of factual errors. We have already dealt with some of those charges in a response to critics in the London Review of Books. We are now writing a very lengthy response to our critics that will show that these various factual criticisms are without foundation. And if anybody's curious, I'm happy to walk through some of the responses there. I won't take the time to. But I might add, most of these criticisms dealt with really secondary issues. Just to take one, Benny Morris goes after us for some interpretations of the 47-48 War of Independence. I think he's wrong. But even if I totally conceded that point, that doesn't have any real bearing on our main arguments about the lobby's influence today. Again, I'm not saying Benny's right, but even if he was, it was a kind of secondary issue to raise. The second point is there were a number of people who argued that this article shouldn't be taken seriously because it was sloppy. Again, I think all of the places where they accuse us of that are not convincing. But you just want to ask yourself how plausible it was that Professor Mearsheimer and I were sloppy at this moment in our careers. John and I have written 6 books between us and over 100 scholarly articles. Many people have disagreed with things we have written in the past. No one has ever accused us of being sloppy. All of a sudden, we decide to write an article on this topic, grabbing the third rail, and this is the moment where we're suddenly going to get cavalier and careless in our scholarship. You'd think that this would maybe be the moment where they would actually have gotten very careful to make sure they had checked all their facts very carefully. Again, if anybody wants to raise specifics, I'm happy to address it. Now, finally, when people who aren't connected to the lobby look at our scholarship, they tend to agree with us. For example, Michael Massing in the New York Review of Books, he repeated some of the bogus charges, and I'm sorry he did that, but his bottom line is quite clear, and I quote, "On their central point, the power of the Israel lobby and the negative effects it has had on U.S. policy, Mearsheimer and Walt are entirely correct." Similarly, L. Carl Brown of Princeton recently wrote in Foreign Affairs that, quote, the paper is neither sloppy nor anti-Semitic, and said it was a hard-headed analysis that just might set in motion a useful paradigm shift in U.S. Middle East policy. All right, needless to say, we're delighted that the conversation has started to focus on substance rather than personalities or individuals, and there's a simple reason for that. Our country faces very serious problems in the Middle East. In Iraq, with Iran, there's the whole problem of Saudi Arabia and possibilities of jihadi terrorism arising from that, how to deal with that problem, and of course the tragic conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. These are all incredibly vexing, challenging, difficult problems, and I don't begin to claim I have the answers to all of them. But I am convinced we are not going to be able to deal with any of those issues effectively if we can't discuss them openly and honestly, and if we can't discuss all of the different forces that shape our policy in the region. And we wrote the article because there was an important part of our policy, an important driver of that policy that people were not talking about. That's why I'm grateful to be here and why I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks very much. You were the fastest hand.
It In a piece at Salon.com in April, Michelle Goldberg said that the real problem is not that the lobby supports Israel, but that it consistently supports right-wing irredentist factions in Israel, and that in doing so it is out of step with most American Jewish opinion as well as much Israeli opinion. She goes on to discuss the lack of support for the peace efforts of Yitzhak Rabin. Whether you characterize the problem as being one of right-wing policies or militarist or expansionist policies, why wouldn't it have been better for you to cast your argument in those terms rather than speaking more broadly of support for Israel or support for the Israeli government?
That's a great question. First of all, I think her characterization is pretty accurate. I had, as you would imagine, some disagreements with some of the things she wrote in the piece, but on that I by and large agree. And again, that's not all that unfamiliar from the world of sort of interest group politics. The example I always like to use is to say that the National Rifle Association doesn't represent the views of the median American, and it doesn't even represent the views of the median American gun owner. Right, that often the sort of groups who are key in lobbying organizations are more extreme than their members for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that's true, especially now. I think, if you look on AIPAC, it's clear that AIPAC has evolved over time and has become a little bit more hardline. It's also true that there are other groups, and we tried to make this clear, although briefly, in the article, that there are other groups, Israel Policy Forum, Jewish Voice for Peace, Americans for Peace Now, that don't agree on many of these issues, and there's a range of opinion here as well. That said, would it have been better to approach it that way if we had had more space? We were somewhat constrained in terms of space to do a full discussion of the full range of opinion within these groups. And second, with the exception of some of the most, let's call them left-wing groups, like Jewish Voice for Peace, very few of these groups, I think of, say, the Israel Policy Forum here, they question Israeli policies, they question some American policies, but they don't question American support. As the desire for unconditional or large, not entirely unconditional support is still there in most of them. Again, your basic point I largely agree with, that we could have perhaps been more effective in portraying them if we'd had a little bit more space to talk about the differences. We do note that there are differences and make it clear that we understand this is not a single centralized movement that agrees on every single issue. And if we do additional writing on this, we'll undoubtedly spell that out in more detail. I just want to say one other point about Prime Minister Rabin. Prime Minister Rabin, I think, clearly understood that the occupation had to be either eliminated or altered, that had to come to some agreement with the Palestinians. But it is worth noting that, as far as I know, he never spoke publicly about a Palestinian state. And because of his tragic death and because of how the peace process went from there, he's now revered as this wonderfully far-sighted, benevolent, almost peacenik, which he wasn't. Right? The settlements continued to be built while he was prime minister, and he never openly called for the creation of a Palestinian state either. We just want to be a little bit careful not to do a sort of, I think we would have been better off had he remained alive, obviously, and had he been able to continue to his own political evolution there. I think he was quite realistic in a number of ways, but I just wanted to correct that slightly. Your basic point I liked a lot, though. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to bring up a somewhat different view on this. And I get this from the rejoinder in the New York Review of Books to their article discussing your work. And that is that, I'm sorry, I forgot his name. He said that there was a quid pro quo, that actually Israel gave Americans a lot in return. For instance, that it arranged the Iran-Contra deals. Now, recognizing my family's background and what it has cost us as German Jews. This suggests to me that not only has this Israel lobby maneuvered the American government, but it has put Israelis in that same miserable position between the aristocrats and the peasants. They have suckered up to power to their great detriment, because it means that this Iran-Contra thing was a disgusting misuse of power in our government. And yet it was facilitated through Israel. And I'd like you to speak to that and how this could be blunted, how could this be counteracted in some way for a more historical.
There's a tall order there. There's no question that in a number of other ways, the U.S. relationship with Israel, like the U.S. relationship with a number of our other allies, has cooperative elements. I mentioned that during the Cold War, you can make a pretty good argument that Israel was a strategic asset. One of the things it did, for example, was provided the United States with useful intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. Now, when a Mideast war happened and they captured a bunch of Soviet equipment, they would let us take a look at it so we'd learn more about it. Nobody thinks we won the Cold War as a result of the military intelligence we got, but it was useful, it was valuable, and we shouldn't disparage it. And we, again, in our paper, talk about this as a positive contribution. The example you made is kind of an interesting one. Here we have a case of an ally that helps us out in a completely harebrained scheme that we're engaged in, and there were various reasons, I think, why the Israelis were doing it. There were various reasons why the American government was doing it. And some of the people who were involved in arranging this thing do have, links to various groups in the lobby. But this is one where I actually would not be inclined to blame the Israel lobby on what happened. It was one of those sort of dumb things that allies occasionally do for one another. I do think that if we had a more open discourse about American policy in that part of the world, some of those things would be less likely to happen. But that may be a little bit naive and idealistic on my part. I want to go to this side of the room. Yes, sir. That was you.
Okay, fantastic. I was wondering what you would say to the argument or claim that a reconsideration of American support for Israeli policy would destabilize Kadima and kind of push Israeli support towards a more radical Benjamin Netanyahu and a harder line Kadima party, or Likud party.
I haven't thought about that. I think you can make either argument. It seems to me that, yes, there's some possibility that if the United States were starting to use the leverage at its disposal to try, and the main issue here is to try and bring about a lasting peace arrangement between Israel and the Palestinians, which I can't imagine it happening without creating a viable state for the Palestinian people, with various arrangements that would satisfy Israeli security concerns. Now, you could make the argument, if we start putting a lot of pressure on the Israelis, this will cause a backlash in Israel. They'll dig in their heels. They'll elect a really hardline government, and then we'll really be screwed, and we'll feel like we've caused this problem. You can make a counter argument, which was, to me, to say, look, if the Israelis understood that they had a choice, they can end the occupation, negotiate a viable state for the Palestinians, and remain a very close, cherished American ally. That's option one. Or they can persist with the occupation and suffer the progressive loss of American support. That's the choice you face. I think many Israelis might say, gee, we would like to move towards option one, not option two. I don't know enough about the sort of fine workings of the Israeli political system or the electoral system, which I might add is a pretty unpredictable system anyway, to know which one of those is most likely. I don't think this is the kind of thing that ought to happen in a sort of draconian fashion, right? You don't call up a country and say, you have till next Tuesday to turn your policy around. The problem is that here we are, the United States of America, and we're completely hamstrung from doing anything about this. And even on the couple of moments when President Bush has tried to distance himself a little bit, as he did, for example, in 2002, when the Israelis went back into the West Bank, the amount of pressure he has faced and the amount of pressure put on him by Congress, responding again, I think, to pressure from the lobby, has been quite striking. So this is not going to happen quickly, if at all. At least we can begin to talk about it. I think, yes, ma'am.
Welcome to Missoula. Welcome to Missoula. I have a point of clarification, please. Did you say that the majority of the Jewish American population is not interested in what's going on in Israel?
No, I think I said a significant fraction or a significant percentage. The last survey that I saw, which is a little bit dated, and these numbers are undoubtedly going to fluctuate. I think it said that when asked if Israel was an important concern for them, 30% of those surveys said no.
Okay.
But 30%, it's not anywhere near 60%.
Okay, and then you said that most of the financial funding for AIPAC comes from Jewish Americans?
Yes, but those 2 points, well, go ahead. What?
No, I'm just trying to clear it up in my mind. If you could explain what you meant or how I got my...
Well, I don't think there's a contradiction there. What I was suggesting is that within the Jewish American population, there's a significant fraction, not a majority, but a significant fraction, for whom Israel is just not a very important issue. Not hostile, it's just not part of their political agenda for whatever set of reasons. Presumably, they don't give a lot of money to AIPAC because they just don't care. Then there's this other fraction that when you survey them say, yes, it is an important concern, but of course, not all of them would be sending money to these organizations per se, and some percentage of Jewish Americans, I think, are strongly opposed to many of the positions that AIPAC stands for. I've been getting emails from some of them. I might add that if you look at the reaction to our article, our most strident attackers and our most vociferous defenders are all Jewish. It's quite, with the exception of Zbigniew Brzezinski. So Tony Judd, who wrote a very supportive op-ed in the New York Times, is Jewish. Phil Weiss of the New York Observer, who's written pieces in The Nation and elsewhere, is also Jewish. Some of the people who have attacked us are Jewish, and then there's plenty of other, Catholics, Protestants, and everybody else who either likes or dislikes us, and that's America. Then one more over here. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll go back to this side.
Is there a formal relationship between the Christian Zionists and the Israel lobby?
Well, the way we define the Israel lobby, again, is that it includes them, right? So, all right, so it's a loose coalition, right? It's not just one big centralized movement with a headquarters and a secret decoder ring or anything like that. It's an interest group like most other interest groups. That has a number of different components, and they disagree with each other on some issues, and they agree on a lot of other issues. There have clearly been connections, conversations, talks between some of the Christian Zionist organizations. They often have offices, or I guess office is good enough word, over in Israel. They organize tours and things like that. I'd call it a sort of tactical alliance. It's, to me, I don't want to offend anybody's religious beliefs here, but it's a tactical alliance that's a little bit peculiar if you understand Christian Zionist theology. Because the role that Israel plays in Christian Zionist theology is not a happy one, right? Basically, that's where the end of the world begins, and if you don't convert, right, you don't get taken up in the rapture. So I think this is seen as sort of a useful tactical alliance that bolsters support at home. But I have to assume, I don't know this, but I have to assume that people in AIPAC and Israelis understand it's useful to have their support, but they don't think the theology is accurate at all. It's kind of inconsistent if they did. Yes, sir.
You back at Kennedy seems to have recently touched another of the third rails, and it's not totally disconnected, it seems to me. These two things go together. I talked, of course, about Muhammad Khan's visit there and the reaction in the United States to that, and either it's ignored that he was there, or you get the impression that one cannot speak out very strongly in favor of approaching the more moderate elements in Iran. And it seems to me that is an equally dangerous posture a country is in.
Does everyone know what this is a reference to? The Kennedy School of Government has lots of speakers come through, world figures of various kinds, and last, I think it's maybe today, or yeah, shows you how out of it I am now that I'm on sabbatical. That the former president of Iran, Mohammad Khatami, was invited to speak. He was doing a tour of the United States. I think he was speaking at the United Nations, and a member of our staff, I actually don't even know who originally had the original idea, said, why don't we invite him to come here, which we did, and he accepted. And it became a little bit politically controversial. The governor of Massachusetts said he wouldn't provide a Massachusetts state trooper escort for him, so we had to provide our own security, or I guess maybe the mayor of Boston said he would do it. And there have been a number of articles written very critical of this decision. Several of them, of course, immediately link it to us. Just as a personal note on this, I had no idea this was happening. I spent a lot of the summer kind of on vacation and didn't know it was being considered. I had stepped down as academic dean. Nobody asked my opinion. I don't know why. And I got a couple of press phone calls, but it was really one of these, I really had no idea. That said, we have invited all sorts of people to speak in what we call the forum. It's our big sort of auditorium area, to speak in the forum. It doesn't involve an endorsement. It doesn't involve agreement with their positions. It's obviously people of some stature where we believe they ought to be listened to. One of the requirements for speaking in the forum, never broken, is that you can't just give a speech. You have to take questions from the audience, and the questions are unedited, uncensored, unscripted. People line up at the microphones and just fire away. And we've not changed that rule for anybody. So in bringing him or inviting him to speak, we were also inviting him to stand up there and answer any questions that were delivered. These are webcasts, so if you go to the Kennedy School's website, you can watch the whole thing. I don't know if it's up yet, but when I get back to Boston, one of the things I'm going to do is, because I wasn't able to go to it, was see what he said and see what the answers were.
But my point,
sorry. Anyway, sorry.
Whether one discerns in the reaction here, and in a lot of other things, that one of the things it's not easy to talk about in this country now is the fact that there are many strains in the Iranian society, that he was a reformist premier, prime minister, president, whatever president he is, and that our unwillingness to even talk to them is
and I made a brief allusion to it in my remarks here, where our policy, I think, towards Iran would have been more flexible. That we would have, I think, followed up on some of the overtures they've made, which doesn't mean that would have led anywhere positive. You never know when you start a dialogue with another country, particularly where you have some real differences, if you're actually going to work them out or not. They may get worse. What we do know is that the trend line in the policy we have been following, so we're not going to talk to them, or, and I'll say more about this tonight, the policy we've tended to have towards Iran is, look, you give us what we most want up front as a precondition for discussions, and then we'll talk about what you're interested in. And most of us know that that's not the best way to negotiate, right? To ask for what you really want up front. And again, I think the results speak for themselves. We know from lots of different sources that there is actually surprising amounts of sympathy, or at least interest or positive attitudes towards the United States in many parts of the Iranian population, particularly the younger elements in the population. Unfortunately, our policies have been such as to strengthen the more hardline elements and disempower the more moderates. Again, I am not saying that had we responded more positively to these overtures, we would have been able to work things out. I'm not sure that Iran will give up its nuclear ambitions, even if the reformers come back in and you get a much more moderate government, because I can understand why Iran might want to have a nuclear arsenal, even though I don't think that would be a good thing. But it's pretty clear that the response we've had, which is, I think, emblemized by the protests of Khatami's visit, of sort of not talking to them at all, doesn't solve any problems. You'll recall that the Soviet Union was led by a bunch of mass murderers, and Mao Zedong was a mass murderer too, and somehow the United States found it possible to have conversations with both of those governments, not because we agreed with them, not because we endorsed them, but because we understood we had to do business to try and advance our own interests. And given how powerful the United States is, we ought to be able to negotiate with these countries from a relative position of strength and not be quite so afraid about talking to them. Yes, sir.
Short comment and then a couple of questions. First of all, I think you give AIPAC too much credit. I'm sure they probably love to be as powerful as you probably say they are. Maybe that's overstating your case in response to some of your critics. We've sort of thrown everything on the wall here, and certainly some of it sticks, but probably two things that don't are the notion that the Iraq War, the United States invading Iraq, that AIPAC had much to do with that at all. It's pretty clear that George Bush had that on his mind even before he became elected president. And second, the American response to Lebanon is consistent with Bush's foreign policy that there's a military solution to everything, and diplomacy is an inconvenience only when necessary. But the real question I had is if AIPAC is among those 100 organizations that have undue influence in Washington, what do you propose to do? I mean, we've got a problem here. If you're an American patriot and you support Israel, what should we do here? Should AIPAC change its bylaws so it more represents American Jewry, or should we have legislation that reduces the undue influence of all these organizations?
That's a great question. I'm now about to solve all the problems of American government. Let me just, I want to respond briefly to your two questions, and then, or your two comments, and then I'll get on the question. I disagree with you on Bush. I don't think Bush had his mind made up on Iraq one way or the other when he took power. We know from a number of different accounts of the early months of the Bush presidency that people who I would call sort of inside the lobby, Paul Wolfowitz and others, were pushing this one, but they weren't making any headway. That Bush obviously wasn't going to embrace Iraq, but wasn't willing to do anything significant militarily or otherwise against them. And it hadn't played a big role in the campaign in 2000. In fact, Condoleezza Rice wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where she basically said the way to deal with Iraq is to contain it. We follow a policy of deterrence the same way we've dealt with other thug regimes in the past, right? And doesn't talk at all about regime change or overthrowing, things like that. There's also this wonderful anecdote that I think is in one of Bob Woodward's books where I think it's maybe Cheney goes to Wolfowitz and tells him to stop bringing up Iraq all the time because it's getting on the president's nerves. Right? He was like a parrot bringing up Iraq all the time. So I don't think he was sold prior to September 11th. September 11th, I think, is critical to flipping both Cheney and Bush to favoring a policy that others had been pushing for a while. But even there, right, Wolfowitz on September 15th at Camp David, the first big meeting to what do we do after September 11th, Wolfowitz says we go after Iraq. He wanted to do Iraq before Afghanistan. And Bush says no, bin Laden's in Afghanistan, we're going there first. That is, however, the moment when Iraq gets on the table as a serious option, and the military planning for it actually begins, I think, in November of 2001. On Lebanon and I think, yes, I agree with you that we kind of bought into this idea that you could solve all these problems with air power. We were insufficiently critical of it, and that was wrong. The one place that's not consistent, of course, with Bush's foreign policy is, again, we were all in favor of encouraging democracy in the Middle East, and the very fragile democracy in Lebanon was one of our few success stories there, and the idea that we then tell our ally to go ahead and do whatever you want to the entirety of Lebanon. It would have been one thing if we'd said, okay, fine, go after Hezbollah, but make sure it's just Hezbollah, and leave Beirut alone, and leave the airport alone, and please don't hit all the radar facilities and all of these other things throughout it. All right, don't turn Lebanon back 20 years, be very discriminating about this. That would have been consistent with our overall policy, but that's not what we did. Now, fixing all of American government. This is kind of not my field, that is to say American politics, but a couple of points. One, it's hard for me to believe that we will undermine the impact of lobbies in all subjects without campaign finance reform. Right? Money just plays way too big a role in American government right now, but don't hold your breath waiting for meaningful campaign finance reform. That wouldn't eliminate the impact of a variety of these groups, because there, money in elections and all of that is not the only source of influence and power, right? A lot of it is also things people write and say and talk and managing discourse, but that would go a long way. The second, and it gets back to the very first question, is I do think one is starting to see more of a dialogue both on this issue. Maybe it has something to do with our article, maybe not, I really don't know. But even a dialogue within the various organizations that you could call sort of pro-Israel organizations, and starting to question a bit more. As some of you undoubtedly know, the range of public debate on these subjects within Israel is quite broad. If you read Haaretz, you read even the Jerusalem Post, Maariv, some of these other publications in Israel, they're all over. It's quite a lively exchange and the full spectrum of views. And I think if we can start encouraging that kind of a discussion, right, and if we can increasingly delegitimate the sort of silencing tactics that some of the most ardent defenders routinely like to use, we're going to be better off as a country. It's going to be more consistent with our democratic tradition, where we're supposed to be able to argue about things openly. And ultimately, I think we're going to get better policies, and those policies will be better for all the countries in the region and for us. Again, I don't expect this to happen overnight, though. All the way in the back. A little louder, please.
I wonder if you could speak to Israel's relationship with China. You mentioned that they sell technology, developing their technology, to China. How is that, given that China is the only military power that's rising that could actually be a security threat to the United States, how in fact that is a U.S. in policy?
Well, the case I'm referring to is where when we provide military technology to other countries, whether we either sell it or we give it or we arrange other ways for them to get it, we often put restrictions on it. So we have to tell them about it, how it works, things like that. There have also been a number of sort of joint projects we've done with various Israeli defense industries of different kinds. And this is true, by the way, when we deal with our NATO allies and others. Say, by the way, you can't give this to the following countries, you can't sell it to people without our permission, etc. It makes just perfect sense from our national security point of view. And there have been several incidents, the most recent one I know of involving some high technology equipment, I think involving radars and AWACS and things like that, where we discovered the Israelis were selling the stuff to the Chinese to make money, possibly to make some friends over there too. And this made people in the U.S. Pentagon, this was actually early in the Bush administration, very angry for all of the understandable reasons. And they went to the Israelis and yelled at them, and apparently they worked things out. I don't know exactly what the final resolution was because I'm not cleared to know. But the point is not that this is something that is, I now speaking sort of as a realist, look, international politics is a hardball business, and I kind of understand if the Israelis did that, right? I don't think this is some enormous moral crime. Similarly, I think it's unfortunate for us that they spy on us, but we spy on them. Everybody spies on everybody else. My problem is that when they do this, they never pay a price for it, right? There's sort of no penalty for having done something like this. So it's not that I'm singling this practice out as particularly heinous, or do I think they've suddenly rendered the United States vulnerable to China because they sold some technology. It just suggests that I only use this as an example of our support occurs irrespective of Israeli behavior, irrespective of what they do to us that we like or don't like. That's all. all the way in the back.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that Israel receives $3 billion a year, and my understanding is that that's through the Camp David agreements negotiated in the late 70s. Isn't it true that Israel actually receives in excess of $3 billion a year in the form of debts being forgiven, military packages, and anti-terrorist grants through, like, since 1993 on that issue?
Yeah, the $3 billion is sort of the canonical direct economic military assistance. There are a variety of other things that take a lot longer to describe in terms of joint, as I said, joint technology projects, where these are, in a sense, kind of subsidies to Israel's defense industry. There's a terrific Congressional Research Service report on this by Clyde Mark that sort of summarizes a lot of these things. We've described some of them also in the article in a little bit more detail. There are also some special arrangements that attend the $3 billion, or the roughly $3 billion. Israel, as I recall, is the only country that doesn't have to give a full accounting for how it's spending the money. Right? So we don't actually know money being fungible. And also, it gets its money in one big lump rather than in quarterly installments, which means it gets to earn extra interest on the money through the year. Again, this is kind of a minor thing, but it's another little bit of legislation that Congress has been willing to pass. But you're right, if you actually totaled up all the in-kind transfers in various deals, it's more than $3 billion. Although I don't think, it's not like it's $20 billion or anything like that. So $3 billion is a pretty good rough number to use.
The best saying that I've read about you folks appeared in an English language publication, perhaps the Jerusalem Post. And it was saying, whoa, going to your moral argument about democracy, our democracy is a lot more informed than the American democracy. And it actually used your argument, or used the notion of the Israel lobby to make the point, saying we in Israel, when we look at what the Israel lobby does in the United States, maybe half of us are for it, half of us are against it, or we talk about it and we, a lot of us, as you mentioned before, there's a huge, there are lots of thoughts and lots of opinions. But in this country, when it is, the Israel lobby is sort of monolithic. This is what's needed, and that was the point of the little article. Perhaps you read it.
No, that's one I think I missed. Although I thought I caught most of them.
Well, yeah, I would think your clipping service.
I actually don't have a clipping service, but friends do send things to me periodically when they want to cheer me up.
So I think the point in this one, because it was quite.
Say a little bit more, because I'm not fully grasping the thrust of the comment.
They're saying we in this country were so dumb, or we're so uninformed, or we're so uncritical that we'll let something called an Israel lobby, which doesn't, according to them, it's not really particularly the national interest of Israel, but at least all the time being represented by them.
Right.
We, on our side of the ocean, we say, this is, we uncritically say, the Israel lobby wants this, all right. And that was the point. I think it was especially saying to the moral aspect, at least we're an informed democracy, and we don't rule, and they criticize you for not picking up on this.
A couple points. I do think there are many admirable features of Israeli democracy. I think the liveliness of debate there is really quite striking by Americans. It sometimes gets a little out of hand, but so does ours periodically. And I want to underscore a point I made earlier. We were not singling Israel out for criticism on this democracy grounds to sort of say, it's a deeply inferior democracy to our wonderful democracy here in the United States. But again, this is a sort of social science point, right? We were trying to make an argument about the power of a set of interest groups. In order to make that argument as persuasive as possible, you have to deal with enough of the critical counter-arguments. And for us, the two big counter-arguments that the other side advances are either the strategic argument that there's a tight alliance here it's very good for our national security here, and that's where we should do it. It's in our best interest, selfish best interest, or rather it's a set of moral arguments that I already rehearsed. So that's why we brought that issue up, not to single them out for criticism. I'll say one other point, though. I think you could make a pretty good argument that Israeli democracy is not nearly as far-sighted as that particular author thinks. And yes, there's a very lively debate, and I have actually some considerable sympathy for many of the strategic problems they have had to wrestle with. But I'm also struck by the number of Israeli writers and authors who are sort of deeply frustrated by a number of the catastrophic blunders that they have made in the past few years. I think, again, Lebanon, with the passage of time, will be seen as having been a major strategic setback. The original invasion of Lebanon in 1982, where they were left there for 18 years, lost many soldiers to no good avail, created Hezbollah as an organization. Right? The Shia population in southern Lebanon welcomed the Israeli invasion at first, and then when the Israelis stayed there, they turned against them. Hezbollah was formed, and look at where that's ultimately led. And finally, the failure to seize upon the opportunity afforded by the Oslo Accords in 1992-93, which I think was, again, this golden opportunity to finally solve their major remaining security issue, namely the problem with the Palestinians. And due to some combination of American blunders, Israeli blunders, and Palestinian blunders, that deal didn't get done. But much of that responsibility for me rests on the Israeli side, and that's terrible. And so again, I don't want to overstate that they really are very far-sighted and we're really idiots. Also, running the whole world is hard work, and I'll talk about that tonight. Thank you very much.